So welcome everyone to our webinar today on environmental dimensions of conflict in Ukraine. Today we are joined by Owen Derbyshire, who is a researcher at the Conflict and Environment Observatory. He has a background in air pollution, research based on in situ and remote sensing measurements in rapidly changing environments. The webinar today will provide an overview and findings from a civil society database of environmental pollution incidents. It will be explained how such independent and verified databases can support further data collection missions from the UN Environment Programme and remediation and legal activities by the Ukrainian government. As always, there'll be a chance to ask questions at the end of the presentation, so please submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation, and I will ask these on your behalf later on. Thank you for logging in today, and I'll now hand over to Owen. Thank you, Owen.
Hello everyone. First of all, thank you to the Institution for Environmental Scientists for providing this platform and letting me share some insights into the environmental dimensions of the conflict in Ukraine. Just to kind of recap, introduction, my name is Owen Derbyshire. I work for the Conflict and Environment Observatory, CEOBS for short, and we are a small UK charity who research and advocate for the environment in conflict settings and from military activity. My job is to lead the monitoring of active and post-conflict zones, allying a combination of ground and satellite-based measurements with testimony from the ground to kind of best characterize and assess the environmental change and risk. And in so doing, calling on my scientific background and kind of background in academia to develop or adopt novel methods and tools. So on to Ukraine. There are so many widespread environmental threads associated with the conflict, and we can't possibly touch on them all in 30 minutes. So for the bulk of my talk, I'm just going to focus on what's going on within the borders of Ukraine. So what exactly is it that we, international and Ukrainian domestic civil society, are trying to monitor in Ukraine? I've tried to boil it down to this one sentence. So anything that may compromise safe air, water, soil, food, and haven, and this is true for humans from a humanitarian perspective, but also the natural environment. So there's kind of two ways to tackle this. The first is to look at single discrete incidents of harm. They might arise directly from the fighting, from an attack or a bomb, or more indirectly. So for instance, we would include within this an attack on some key infrastructure and any like secondary downstream impacts that might follow. On the other hand, another approach is to look at the wider scale at the landscape level and over longer time periods, potentially many years and well into like a post-conflict period. These kind of assessments of large-scale trends of environmental change, that they could include things like agricultural abandonment, deforestation, groundwater decline. Really, there's loads of different kind of possibilities. Clearly, like different tools and methodologies and specialities are required to properly characterize these changes and the downstream impacts, including the humanitarian ones. And as a small organization, this is like clearly a lot to cover, and we do try. But thankfully, we're kind of part of a growing community of civil society, academics, international organizations taking more of an interest in this space. So without further ado, let's look at some kind of examples of what I've been talking about. On this slide, we can see 6 examples of attacks on industrial or infrastructural facilities. Now, Ukraine is like famously a very heavily industrialized nation, and these facilities have been targeted in quite large numbers, so much so that it looks to be an intentional tactic, presumably maybe to hobble the economy, and then with the side effect of lots of environmental damage. So from these images, we can kind of see the diverse range of facilities which have been attacked. We've got a foam production plant, a nitrate tank and a chemical works, a fuel and lubricant storage facility, a logistics warehouse, a thermal power plant, and a food production facility. Now, I'm sure you can all appreciate that from such a range of facilities, there's going to be a diverse mix of chemical releases into the air, into the soil, and into the water. Now, one of the reasons this is particularly concerning in Ukraine is the proximity of industrial facilities to people. So most of them are within densely populated urban areas. So the green dots on this slide, they're just the locations of the sites from the previous slide, and we can kind of go back and forth and see that, yes, these are all within kind of pretty urban settings. As well as the urban settings, it's also worth mentioning that a lot of these kind of sites are in proximity to maybe water courses, rivers, lakes, reservoirs, and some of them are also like in protected areas too. But let's just stick with the topic of populated areas for now. So in some cities, the scale of urban destruction has been, really quite phenomenal. Places like Mariupol on the left here, or Reverberating on the right, and they've been kind of victim to Russia's siege tactics and the use of explosive weapons. Some of the footage is really flabbergasting, actually. And I'm now going to try to play some drone footage, which shows the scale of the damage in Reverberating. So let's hope this works. Is that playing? Okay, so that's playing now. Oh no, there we go. So it's hard to watch something like this this passionately, maybe. But if you just kind of take a look, you'll see massive volumes of debris that have been generated here. And these are going to be containing materials like, asbestos and PCBs. And clearly this poses a significant environmental health and waste management problem. And then in the longer term, there's the problem of rebuilding locations like this, and that brings a whole different type of environmental dimensions, things like embedded carbon and stuff like that. But yeah, I think if you just kind of scan around, we can really just see the total nature of the damage, and it's like this in many places, unfortunately. Very sad. Okay, let's pause it and if we move on now. So there's also been a significant amount of what we call conflict pollution, just associated with the military material. This might include things like the large explosions that we've seen repeatedly at ammunition storage sites, both purpose-built ones, but also kind of field storage sites. And these explosions, they release really high concentrations of heavy metals and energetic materials into the environment. There's also been dozens of attacks on air bases, naval ports, military production or repair factories. And then across the front lines, where the front lines have been, there's these huge volumes of kind of destroyed military hardware. So the example on the right here is the aftermath of an attack on a fuel convoy. As well as that, there's also then the kind of physical impact from the military on the soils and on the landscape. In particular here, I'm thinking of all the trenches that have been dug, particularly in the east of the country. Water infrastructure has also been targeted. So many locations, again, particularly in the east, they've had limited or no access to water for significant periods of time. Actually, one of Russia's first actions in the early day of the war was to gain control over the water supplies to Crimea, which had previously been blocked off by Ukraine. Dams were blown up, pumping stations were rehabilitated, and as a result, water is now flowing back into the peninsula. Although this kind of thing was obviously done with no environmental impact assessment, so it's unknown what the kind of risks of that might be, especially because downstream in Crimea, there's quite a few industrial locations with very patchy environmental records. And actually, where the North Crimea Canal joins the Dnieper, nearby to the occupied Nova Kahova Dam, that's the location we're kind of actively monitoring at the moment. Apparently there's been some damage to some of the generators there, and they're releasing a lot of water downstream, and that's caused a little bit of localized flooding. And there's one kind of rumor or school of thought that this might be a kind of deliberate military tactic. But as well as these kind of big infrastructure things, there's also been, you know, widespread damage to smaller bits of infrastructure, more localized things, pipelines and water towers, as we see in the picture here, which is an example from Chernihiv. So agriculture, that's also been targeted, particularly. Farmland has been heavily affected by mines, by unexploded ordnance, and as we can see here, kind of widespread cratering. So this is an example from just outside Kharkiv, and this is going to be a real kind of legacy problem going forward. As well as that, many agricultural facilities themselves, grain elevators or processing factories, have been directly targeted. And here we can see damage at one of those such sites in Mykolaiv. As well as that, large scale and small scale farm buildings have been targeted, and actually, you know, a lot of livestock have either, you know, been killed by the fighting or had to be killed. And this is kind of a very particular waste stream that usually requires lots of checks and balances, and obviously that's just happened without any of those. And then, of course, there's this nuclear element. So this is the first conflict of its type in nuclear state, and we've seen really astonishing activities from the Russian forces at two of the main sites at Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia, and this has really kind of highlighted the really like direct and indirect risks of conflicts in countries with nuclear infrastructure, and also the weakness of international institutions and norms to kind of prevent that. So Zaporizhzhia is currently still under occupation by the Russian forces, and it's a question: how does this end? Is it, if indeed it does, is it going to be a peaceful handover like we saw in Chernobyl, or something more dangerous? And we know there is kind of Russian defensive positions at the plant. You might have seen there's been a lot of opinion actually on the whole nuclear thing. So a lot of people saying the risk of a major incident is small. You know, reactor wall thicknesses are huge; they can withstand the impacts from an aircraft or whatever. But there's been like relatively less attention paid to the storage of spent nuclear fuel rods. There's quite a few at Zaporizhzhia, and it's kind of more conceivable that they could be damaged, and there could be a kind of serious radioactive release from that. But hopefully not. We'll have to wait and see what goes on and how it plays out. We've also seen protected areas and nature parks being affected by the fighting, particularly through fires. Recently, for instance, large fires have been burning in nature areas in proximity to the front lines. On the left here, we're seeing some forestry plantations near Izium, and that's kind of created large smoke plumes and really poor air quality episodes in urban locations downwind, such as Kherson that we see here on the right. And of course, being able to firefight these fires in conflict conditions is, you know, extremely difficult, if not impossible. There's also a lot of risk to the marine and damage to the marine environment. So naval warfare in the Black Sea has created pollution risks and raised concerns over sensitive habitats. We've seen online a lot of reports of dead dolphins washing up on beaches. And we've also seen a lot of instances of ship fires or ships being sunk. On the left here, we see an example of the chemical tanker, Millennium Spirit, which was burning in the Black Sea for weeks. And there are also reports of lots of sea mines in the region, which pose both a threat to marine life, but also for shipping, which is continuing to some extent, including oil tankers transiting across the Black Sea. And then on land, there's been lots of mining of beaches along the coast near Odessa and Mariupol, as we see here on the right-hand side. So now I'm going to talk to you about what I've been and we've been spending the last 3 months doing, which is collating lots of the examples we've just been going through into our database of a single discrete instance of environmental harm. But first of all, we probably should address the question, why are we doing this? Well, the main reason is to kind of try to assess the scale and the severity of the environmental impact. With a database, you can identify trends and patterns. And then together, the idea is to communicate these to the media through interviews. We've been doing a lot, and to the public through like presentations like this or through publications. And it's kind of important to us that we advocate for the environment in this way to make sure it remains in the conflict's narrative. This is really important, especially post-conflict, to make sure that the resources available and priority is given to what remediation activities need to be done to make places safe to live, and also for building back in a green and sustainable way. So the information we've got in the database is also of interest to the Ukrainian ministry and can be used to help direct their inspectors to gather ground samples and contextual evidence. Likewise, for the UN Environment Programme, they're looking to do some ground scoping and assessment studies, and we're working with them to try provide information to support those activities. Kind of further down the track, there's then talk of reparations, tribunals, maybe even criminal cases, and we're expecting the data to be useful for those avenues. And there it will be complementing other data collections which are ongoing. So this is probably a good place to point out that we have drawn boundaries on what we do and don't include in our database, so as not to overlap with others who are already doing this. For example, we don't include medical facilities, which of course have quite a lot of hazardous waste associated with them because other people are collecting that information. And we don't try and include all of the military material littering the landscape because it's just too large a task. So to move on to a map here, we've been working on data collection actually with another NGO, the Zoe Environment Network, based in Geneva, and they've been using this type of data to generate maps. And here we can see from the start of the invasion in February to the start of May, we can see there's a really geographic spread, and it's not been confined to any particular area. It's kind of across the country. Also, just to kind of pull out some basic statistics from our database, just up to the start of May, just to give a sense of the situation. So there's been 75 incidents at fuel supply facilities, 33 at power supply facilities like power plants, 34 at agricultural sites, 23 at water-related infrastructure, and 39 warehouse events. So these numbers are definitely only the tip of the iceberg. Actually, the damage is likely to be much more significant. We are trying to kind of work back and backdate entries as more information becomes publicly available. But undoubtedly, our database will be incomprehensive and miss many incidents, especially the smaller and more rural ones. So now if we just move on to the methodology, how have we compiled the database? Well, we've got a kind of 6-step pipeline, and I'll try and quickly run you through it. So number one, we need an initial source of information, and thereafter lots more information. Where do we look? I conceptualize a top-down and bottom-up approach. So bottom-up includes information from social media, traditional media, particularly local news sources, tip-offs, or maybe even pre-existing databases. top down includes satellite imagery or data, or even ground-based monitoring networks. And ideally, there's this kind of continuum between the top down and bottom up, or vice versa. And the two approaches can be really complementary and help evidence an event that happened and beyond reasonable doubt. So just a quick comment on the bottom-up sources we've been using. Not typically seen as a rich source of environmental data, social media, but it is perfect for this kind of work, really. So we've been using all the platforms, but particularly Telegram and Twitter, but also the ones you might think are not useful, even LinkedIn. And we've been monitoring both Russian and Ukrainian channels and accounts, which is interesting because you often get independent footage of maybe the same event and very different takes on what's happened. Note, by the way, that our database is not actually interested in attribution, it's just logging the damage, which does make it a little bit more straightforward. So for any given incident, the aim is to find out as much as possible about the event and collate all of this information in a document unique to that incident, with the social media posts and websites archived for posterity and for any legal cases through a separate process. One step we have to do quite often is geolocation. So in many cases, and especially since the law was introduced to stop the sharing of location data in Ukraine, it's been difficult to know where an incident is and what type of facility. So in these cases, one needs to geolocate the incident, and this requires a bit of detective work. So here on this slide, we've got an example from Mariupol in early March. At that time, very little information was coming out of the city, and this kind of Russian drone imagery was one of the few sources of information we had. And starting on the bottom left here, we saw what looked like a large fire at some sort of industrial site, but we didn't know what it was or where it was. So what we had to do was look for some key features to help narrow down the search. So this included the location of the sea. We could work out it was on the left-hand side. A long straight road, which was on the outskirts of the city. A kind of large ditch between agricultural fields, and the kind of crooked drainage channel. And by kind of searching on Google Earth for a location that had all of these features, we were able to identify where the site was. And it was this place with some large kind of storage silos. And then some more detective work, some more Googling actually allowed us to work out the site was a large sunflower seed crushing plant and important for the sunflower oil production, which is one of Ukraine's major exports. So next we need to verify that the incident did occur at the time and location. So this could be done by the sheer weight of evidence, if there are many independent videos, images, or sources of testimony. But in many entries, this isn't the case, and so we have to turn to satellite data to help. And luckily, we're now in an era where there's good open source satellite imagery available in near real time. It isn't at a resolution you might be familiar with from Google Maps, which is something like 30 centimeters resolution. But it is a high enough resolution, about 10 meters, to be able to discern damage and significant impacts, at least for most cases. What's more, some imagery is multispectral, meaning the sensor receives information at wavelengths outside the visible range of the electromagnetic spectrum, and this can provide valuable information. So the example I show here is a hotspot in the shortwave infrared, and again, this is the example of that sunflower production plant. And the red signal here indicates that the surface is still warm, so there's residual burning going on. So we can be kind of confident that there was a big fire at this location. Cloudiness has been a problem actually in Ukraine for using satellite data, but fortunately there's ways around this, such as using synthetic aperture radar satellites, which are not impeded by clouds. So we can gain some insights there. And there are also a host of other data products which have come in use, like fire hotspot data or air pollution retrievals. Just a brief mention here as well on fake news and disinformation. So at times it's difficult to verify an incident, and this opens up the the opportunity or possibility that it might not be real. And this kind of disinformation of environmental information in conflicts is an ongoing trend in many conflict locations, actually. And we expected it to be quite prominent when the invasion started, but actually we found most reporting has been pretty faithful, apart from a few isolated incidents. Nonetheless, we're going to keep a close eye on it, because as the conflict moves and dynamics shift, things might change, and we're always on the lookout for telltale signs. Things like it's impossible to geolocate, there's very accusatory language used, it's shared by very partisan accounts, it conflates issues together, particularly stuff with global warming, or it might be just a big overhyping of kind of small incidents. So we need to remain vigilant. Now, the final part of the methodology is a simple scoring card to crudely assess the environmental risk. The primary purpose of this is to narrow down the incidents to find the most significant ones for more comprehensive impact assessments later on. And the scoring system is really quite simple. There's a score depending on the facility type. So it's a bigger score for a nuclear facility than like a glass industry one. There's another highest score dependent on the damage type. Again, the more significant the damage, the higher the score. And then more scores based on the type of pollution and its severity. So for example, if there was a fire, how long it burnt for, if it's known that there were additional hazardous substances combusting, how big the plume was. And then we can also calculate some things automatically as well based on the latitude and longitude. So how is it within a protected area? Is there a very dense population nearby? Things like this. So, sorry. So with so many incidents, and we're quite a small outfit ourselves, to help kind of flesh out the database and help us with the verification and the documentation required, we've been grateful for the help of some eager volunteers. This is a slightly experimental approach for us to see if this type of work can be crowdsourced, and it will be interesting to see how well it works out in the run of time. Okay, so that was an overview of the database we're curating. I hope you found it interesting, and it's definitely a work in progress for us, and we're learning all the time. But we're just going to kind of step away from that database now and touch on some of the other more reverberating effects of the conflict in Ukraine itself. So at the start of the fighting, there was significant displacement of, well, everyone basically, and this obviously impacted environmental civil society in the country. However, there's since been a regroup. They've reorientated together and doing things towards advocacy now. So they've recently, I think 40 civil society groups launched a joint position statement underlining the requirement for a green reconstruction of the country. And that's a really good sign. There's also been, the reason that's a good sign is because what's common in post-conflict contexts is for big gaps in environmental governance, and this could be repeated in Ukraine because emergency domestic legislation has stripped the need for environmental impact assessments, including that post-conflict period. And it's possible that this will, see expansion of agricultural land or forestry and many other unpredictable ramifications. Okay, so up till this point, we've all been talking about what's going on in Ukraine itself. But of course, the environmental dimensions of the conflict are much further reaching, and we'll briefly look at those now. So possibly the most significant thing is the change in energy policy as the West turns away from Russian gas and oil. Will we pivot to new fossil sources or sustainable ones? Sticking with the climate, there's been large increases in defence spending that have been announced. And we know from our work that militaries are one of the single largest sector sources of greenhouse gas emissions, maybe responsible for 5% of the total emissions. We don't really know because this is a tentative estimate, because so little is known. because militaries are exempt from reporting protocols. This might change. There's recently been some recognition, including from the UK MOD, but overall it probably remains a low priority. And with this increase in defence spending, we're likely to see a lockstep increase in military greenhouse gas emissions. Again, on the climate angle, the whole kind of conflict in Ukraine has acted as a huge diplomatic distraction, really, from the global efforts to stymie carbon emissions. And again, it's likely to overshadow this year's COP in Egypt. Meanwhile, we've had these kind of widespread forest fires burning in Russia, and the military firefighting capacity that's usually used to fight these is thousands of miles away in Ukraine. There's also the kind of Russian scientists to consider maybe, and their role in monitoring climate exacerbators, sort of melting permafrost comes to mind. And staying in Russia recent weeks, actually, we've seen lots of attacks there on industrial facilities. The causes aren't so clear, but it's definitely no coincidence. And just like in Ukraine, these incidents will have an environmental cost for the air, water, and soil. So the last icon here, but by no means the final kind of external environmental impact, it's countless, is the role that the war's played on food security. The blockade of the Black Sea and the targeting of agriculture has caused, difficulties in the global food market and caused big food security insecurity elsewhere, particularly in the Middle East. And this again then might have further knock-on impacts for the environment in those locations. So finally, this is my last slide. I just want to kind of try and end on a bit of a positive by indulging in some thoughts on the coverage of the environment during the conflict. So actually, we helped compile an issue of environmental scientist for the IAS back in June 2020, and I'm sure we probably covered our usual line, which is saying the environment is a silent victim of war. And this has actually been the case, since the year dot. But now actually in Ukraine, there's been an unprecedented level of coverage. We're fielding multiple media interviews each week and to kind of high-level publications. I'd recommend listening to Monday's Costing the Earth podcast on Radio 4, which we're on. It's really good. And for us, this coverage is brilliant, tiring, but brilliant. We're finally seeing a level of consideration for the environment, a recognition of how important it is for the lives and livelihoods of those impacted by conflict. And that's really good. So I think with that, I'll just move on to just a summary slide to have up during the Q&A. And once again, give my thanks to the IAS and to the audience for listening to me.
Perfect, thanks Owen. Very, very interesting webinar, really eye-opening. We do have a few questions, so I'll just work through them. Alan is asking, do we have any idea of food growth areas currently contaminated, e.g. wheat?
So yeah, so there's just miles upon miles of wheat fields in Ukraine, and yeah, and some of those have been where the fighting positions have been. So I don't know if you can remember the image I showed of that really cratered field outside the Kharkiv. That's repeated at multiple locations. And there's going to be lots of kind of unexploded ordnance there, lots of residues from the weaponry, and undoubtedly this is going to, this contaminates the agricultural land, so there's going to be loss of crops associated with it.
Okay, Kezia is asking, to what degree do you measure the impact upon non-human animals through your assessment of environment impact?
So this is it's a really good question, and it kind of speaks to the limits of what we can do sat here in Leeds. We can see the big things that you can see on satellites, fires, buildings, etc. But individual animals, that's something that's basically impossible to do remotely. That's where you need people on the ground doing the work, doing the surveys, and that's something that's been difficult for the conservationists in Ukraine to do themselves, because they've not been able to access their sites, or lots of them are men and they've been called up, for example. So it's quite hard to understand scale of that damage at this point, I think.
Kate is asking, given the climate change is likely to lead to water scarcity and water wars, could we see water infrastructure increasingly targeted in cross-border conflicts?
I mean, definitely what we see across lots of different conflicts is water infrastructure gets targeted and gets damaged, and it's easy to do. It's not protected, it's not armored, and you can easily wipe out water to a population, or flood an area, or poison an area. In relation to kind of international warfare, it's something we see less, and whether that will increase with climate change is very contentious. You know, there is a school of thought that there will be more water wars. There's an alternative school of thought that actually what we'll see is more cooperation. And I think we're kind of, as an organisation, quite keen to suggest that second option of cooperation through peace building and using the environment as a tool to actually build trust. Now, that's not going to work everywhere in all contexts, not in Ukraine, for example, but other places it might, and it's worth exploring.
Thank you. Can you give practical examples of technical contributions to your project by volunteers?
So what we've asked of the volunteers has been, at this point, kind of very, like, we've given them a bit of a formula to follow, like a recipe book kind of book, and that's just been going through social media, trying to find as much information as possible, try and work out the start time, verify the location or find the location, and then do a very kind of rough and brief and crude environmental assessment, depending on their kind of level of expertise. So actually nothing incredibly technical yet, but as we move kind of forward and dig deeper and go into more technical detail at the highest risk sites, then that's definitely something we might kind of look to and kind of see if there's volunteers that are willing to help.
Great. We just have two more questions. Would you know of any incentives to restore Ukrainian environment after the war?
And any incentives? It's an interesting question. I guess it's going to have to come. Obviously, there's the Ukrainians themselves, the Ukrainian environmental civil society are trying to push this message hard that we need to build back sustainably and build healthy environments. But that's only going to happen if there's money to do it, basically, or if there's direction from the people providing the money to do it. So this is why it's important to kind of keep, as I said, keep the environment keep the environment in the conflict narrative. So then when a lot of the donors, like the EU, for example, giving money for the reconstruction, then they can also say, well, yeah, but make sure you do it in a sustainable way.
Perfect. The last question then is, not sure where the law of ecocide has reached, but surely should be applicable in this case.
So it's a good question. So there's different interpretations between domestic and international law of what ecocide means, but it's not kind of there yet, and nor is a kind of simultaneous process, a simultaneous legal process into development of principles to protect the environment in relation to armed conflict. There's a whole set of principles going through the International Law Commission, and that's something we're involved with. And they're not quite there yet. So we've got any kind of legal cases that might come out of the conflict have to rely on existing kind of international law, and that's really, really weak when it comes to the environment. And the example to give here is the thresholds which have to be met were not met by the First World War. Yet here we are, over 100 years later, and there's still very contaminated areas of France and Belgium, and the whole place was, torn apart. So we do need better, legal protections for the environment. I totally agree with that.
Thank you for answering the questions, and thank you again for a really great presentation. That's it from us today. Attendees, thank you for logging in, and we hope you found that beneficial and informative.